obviously with less cocoa in the product, there's different maximum concentrations. Now those are not in action yet. They're proposed to come in action from the 1st of January 2019. That's the proposal of the European Union. This is the proposal from Codex at the moment, and Codex has got very many stages the MLs go through before they're accepted. There will no doubt be arguments from the EU that these values are too high. But I think Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil have got very, very good reason to argue if you can prove that cadmium is geogenic, if you can prove that good agricultural practice leads to these concentrations. It is a very strong argument in Codex. I thank Carlos for telling me about this particular publication because it's in Spanish and I don't read a lot of Spanish papers. So this was actually from one of your soil science conferences in Ecuador. And this is the map of the cadmium distribution in soils in Ecuador. So this is going some of the way to looking at some of the things you've got to do. It's a pity it wasn't a geochemical survey of the whole country. And you relate it to rock type. And you relate it to relief and topography, because that then gives clues as to the source of the cadmium. So some of these high cadmium areas might be anthropogenic, but I suspect a lot of it is geogenic. That's my suspicion. This is data from the same publication. This is cadmium in the soil, and these are the 4 depths. So 1, 2, 3, 4 for all these different sites. And obviously there's low cadmium sites here, but these high cadmium sites, you can see some of them have got constant or increasing cadmium with depth. And for me that screams geogenic origin. Some of them might have a distribution like this, which is very concentrated at the surface. Possibly anthropogenic, not confirmed because you do get biological pumping. But certainly these soils on a global scale are high cadmium. But I think it's geogenic. Eduardo Chavez has done some work recently, his PhD at University of Florida, trying to tease out some of those soil-plant relationships with multivariate regressions of soil properties. And again, this is really important to identify high-risk areas, to set trigger values in soils, and to give you an idea of what you can do for amending the soil. And here you can see MELIC 3 features quite a lot, but also electrical conductivity of the soil. This is the regression relationship of the cadmium and the cocoa to the soil properties. So the EC in the soil, my suspicion is it's a chloride thing, don't know. And obviously pH being quite important, and percent claim total carbon. All the things that we know that can bind cadmium in soil are coming into those regression relationships, and for 2 different depths. So this is really good first work to try and tease out what needs to be done. Just a few concluding comments then. Cadmium does pose a concern in agriculture, not for toxicity to plants, not for toxicity to organisms. It's a food chain contaminant. The control of cadmium in agricultural systems really needs a combined approach of identifying the high-risk areas. You need to understand those soil factors that lead to high plant cadmium, and you need to have those intervention strategies, so the remediation, if you like, that can reduce that risk of soil plant transfer. I would strongly say field-based experimentation is really critical, because in the end, it's the farmers in the field who are going to be putting those amendments or practices on the ground. You always have to field validate any of your proposed treatments. In relation to cocoa, and I'm probably stretching things here now because there's lots of people who know more about cocoa than me in the audience. I think you've got a pretty good, listening to the talks yesterday, you've got a pretty good research program and looking at what's in the literature, looking at the soil-plant relationships of cocoa today. You have identified where the high-risk areas are, and you've got some very good information on the spatial distribution down the profile and horizontally. I really think you need to do a whole-of-country geochemical survey that is so informative to looking at lots of different things, not just cadmium. It'll be so informative in terms of lead contamination in urban areas, zinc contamination of soils from reuse of waste from soil. It really is a very useful thing to do. From what I saw yesterday, certainly a lot of remediation, or some remediation trials are being tried. I think you've probably got a fair bit more to do in terms of remediation strategies. And think zinc, think lime, think sorbents, and think combinations thereof. Cocoa might be difficult in terms of getting new varieties because of the long time it takes to produce one, but also the long lead time to get it into production. I think it's really important that Ecuador is quite strong in intervening at codex level and arguing very strongly that the concentrations that you're finding now are as low as reasonably achievable because the cadmium is geogenic, the agricultural practices are good, and therefore that should be taken into account in relation to setting the codex in there. And I say that as long as contamination is not causing high cadmium in cocoa. If it's something to do with mining and irrigation water being contaminated, if it's something to do with amendments going on soil, contaminating it, that is not a good argument to take to codex. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was a wonderful presentation and very informative. Vamos a tener otra vez los micrófonos en el salón. Tenemos aproximadamente 10 minutos. Voy a ser un poquito estricto con el tiempo porque tenemos un coffee break afuera que el hotel nos sirve con una hora fija. El ingeniero Guamaní, por favor, tiene una pregunta. Después del ingeniero Santiago Pastor en este lado.
Sí, muchas gracias. Como usted dijo, hay que compartir información. Mi primera intervención es compartir. Nosotros hemos trabajado en campo, los experimentos es directamente en campo. Hemos encontrado una relación en época de cosecha. Cuando la época de cosecha es lluviosa, menos cadmio tiene en el medio. Y cuando la época es seca, más cadmio. No encontramos explicación. Asimismo, en plantaciones de más edad, menos cadmio. En plantaciones jóvenes, más cadmio. Hay variedades que se están identificando que tienen menos capacidad de absorción de cadmio en almendras. ¿Sí? Eso es la información. No he escuchado la relación fósforo en este proceso sin cadmio. ¿Por qué digo esto? Porque en Tingomanía, selva, necesariamente aplicamos fuentes fosfóricas, rocas fosfóricas, triple, fosfato de amonio, y todas ellas tienen cadmio. Y hemos observado, y hoy día también complementa, deficiencia de zinc y incremento de cadmio. ¿Tiene información sobre la relación fósforo-zinc-cadmio?
Okay, so there's quite a few questions in there. The first comment was in relation to seasonal conditions and cadmium uptake. We also found the same in Australia, and I think it's a combination of, well, I'm speculating now. It could be concentrations of chloride in the soil in a rainy season have moved further down. No? Okay. It could be root distribution. Our root activity is different in a drought year to a good year. So obviously in a drought year, the root activity may be in different layers of the profile. So depending on where cadmium is, that could be a reason where you have different cadmium uptake by the plant. I don't know how cocoa takes up cadmium. Is it all from the surface 5 centimeters, or is it 30 centimeters or 40? With peanuts, we find it was a 10 to 30 centimeter layer that was critical. So you really need to know where the plant is extracting cadmium from. And once you know that, then you'll get an idea of how seasonal conditions can affect it. Your second point, I think, was about phosphatic fertilizers and cadmium content. In our trials, we found that the cadmium content of the fertilizer actually makes no influence at all on cadmium uptake in the short term. The highest cadmiums we got in crops was with low cadmium fertilizer and high phosphorus rate. And again, I think it's an interaction with root exploration of the soil. If you add more phosphorus to the soil, the roots can explore the soil more. And if you have a geogenic cadmium source, you perhaps, by having a higher phosphorus rate, It's exploring more of the natural cadmium in the soil. So you might think it's coming from the fertilizer, but actually you've got an interaction that's happening in the soil between the phosphorus and the plant roots and the geogenic cadmium, possibly. Now there's a comment this morning, also in Ishmael's talk about zinc, and you mentioned zinc as well. The zinc concentrations in manufactured fertilizers have declined not because manufacturers remove zinc. A manufacturer would never remove zinc from a fertilizer because it would cost too much. The reason that zinc concentration in a fertilizer would be reduced is because the fertilizer has been manufactured from a different phosphate rock. So if you have found that the zinc contents in your fertilizer have decreased, it's likely that the source of phosphate rock used to manufacture those has changed. For example, Florida rock is very low in zinc. So mosaic product, mosaic's gone, but I can say it. Mosaic products would be naturally low in zinc unless they fortify the fertilizer with zinc. Some of your indigenous sources here in South America, Peru, Esquimalt, may be higher in zinc. In Australia, we had very high zinc in Nauru and Christmas Island, and we never needed to add zinc to soils.
Very good answer, Mike. Let's go with the next one. Mr. Santiago Pastor from Peru has another question, please.
Sí, buenas tardes. Gracias por la información tan valiosa que nos está brindando. Quería preguntarle si usted le ve algún sentido a que, por ejemplo, en la norma europea se haya establecido el mismo nivel de límite máximo permisible al cadmio que a la papa o que a los cereales, ¿no? Pues tienen el mismo nivel y nadie come tanto chocolate como papa. Y esta es una norma que ya está vigente, pero que se ha, digamos, postergado la vigencia solamente para el chocolate. Y ojo, que es una norma para el chocolate, no es para el cacao. Y eso es una diferencia importante. Que y solamente, y quería saber, en el tema de usted menciona el límite para el suelo, ¿no? Y ese es verdaderamente el límite que habría que usar, los estándares de calidad ambiental del suelo. En el Perú, por ejemplo, para el cadmio es 1.4. La verdad es que no sé exactamente cómo los han establecido y me gustaría saber, usted los ha mencionado para Australia y me gustaría saber cómo los establecen los estándares de calidad ambiental para el suelo de uso agrícola, para el tema de cadmio.
Gracias,
Okay, I think again 2 comments there. The first is the Codex limit for cocoa or chocolate being similar to potatoes or rice or wheat. In my view, there's no sense in having the same limit for cocoa or chocolate as the staple food crops because you eat so much less. And that's the view of JECFA. That is what JECFA has said. The contribution of cocoa-based products to the intake of cadmium in humans is 4% or 3% from the last Codex meeting. So really, there's no argument to keep cadmium limits in potatoes, and wheat, and cocoa the same. There really is none. And I think there's strong arguments at Codex to say that it should be higher in those other products. Your second comment about cadmium limits in soil, there are not many countries that have produced cadmium limits in soil. And there are not many countries that have done the experimental program to define the limit of cadmium in soil because it really depends on a lot of things, pH, zinc content, clay content, organic matter content. The only limits that I've seen for cadmium in soils, I don't know in South America, but in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, the limits are for use of biosolids on land, and they have maximum permitted cadmium concentrations. And it's not often those are set by experimental programs. They're set by asking a few experts what that might be. Oh, yeah, that'll do. That's often how the limit is set.
I would say that probably it's more or less the case around here as well. Dr. Mascul-Grafe has a question, I guess, because of time, that's going to be the last one.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Very interesting presentation. A few years back, Malwin Singh from the University of Sydney published a lot of work about cadmium desorption from goethite and kaolinite and showed very clearly that as cadmium saturates the surface, its desorbability increases tremendously. If you add an amendment that works on the limitation of the surface, a two-dimensional mechanism, eventually your amendment becomes a source of cadmium. Conversely, goethite, for example, can incorporate as much as 7% cadmium. I wonder, do you know of any field trials that look at iron amendments and bicarbonate to incorporate cadmium into an iron oxide structure, which is very stable usually against both pH and redox factors?
Yeah, so the comment here about, number one, the longevity of effects and the effectiveness with cadmium being continually added to the soil. Look, organic amendments are probably less effective in terms of sorption, because in the end the organic matter is going to decompose, and something like a clay mineral such as goethite, where the cadmium can move into the crystal lattice, could be quite good. It has to be cheap, and it has to be easy to apply. We did try this in Australia. We used flue dust from a iron ore smelter, and the idea was it's cheap, they're throwing it away, they'll actually pay you to take it away, and unfortunately it didn't sorb cadmium strongly enough to have any effect on field trials. But something that's got a high sorption and a high fixation would be great. Would be fantastic, but we haven't found that yet. I'm playing around with one thing at the moment, actually. It's just a new thing. So it's a byproduct material made from oil and elemental sulfur, and it's like a vulcanization process. I haven't any data on it yet, but it's very, very effective for mercury, and hopefully cadmium mercury having similar chalcophilic properties, it might be quite good for cadmium. Again, it depends on the longevity of that product, and it has to be non-toxic. The other thing with goethite, it might store a lot of phosphorus. You might increase the phosphorus requirement in your soil. So there's a lot of things you have to think about in getting in situ remediation to work. You've got to sorb cadmium, but not zinc, or add zinc with the sorbent. It's got to be non-decomposable, and it's got to have longevity.
Beautiful answer. Thank you so much. Quisiera pedirles otra vez un aplauso muy generoso. Quisiera reconocer también a Soraya Alvarado por el gran esfuerzo de haber traído al doctor Wendruth, en realidad un gran aporte para la organización del Congreso. Vamos a tener un coffee break ahorita, los invitamos a tomar el coffee break. Les recuerdo que las memorias, la versión preliminar de las memorias, vamos a tener una versión aumentada.